Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to finish off the part that we'll do of the Ramban in chapter 20, verse 8. We've been discussing various ideas in the Mefarshim as to what exactly the sin of Moshe was with the rock, and I want to see one more idea, and that is the Rabbeinu Hananel. It's probably about I don't know 60% of the way through the Ramban. Va'karov min advarim shenemru bazeh v'tov lidchos hashoel. He says what I think is the most likely thing of all the ideas given is Heimtivir Rabbeinu Hananel Zal, the words of the Rabbeinu Hananel Shekasav that he writes, Ki achetu amram notzi lochem mayim min hasela. Says Rabbeinu Hananel, the sin isn't hitting the rock, and the sin isn't that they had to hit the rock more than once, and the sin isn't that he called them rebels. The sin is when Moshe says to them before he brings forth the water, do you think we will bring water forth from this rock? They should have said, do you think God will bring forth water from this rock? Do you think it's possible? And instead they said, do you think we will bring forth water from this rock? That when Moshe talks about the fact that God provides for them meat to eat, he says, when God gives you it. In general, when we talk about the miracles, it's that God did it. Maybe the people's takeaway was, wow, that Moshe and Aaron, they really know that they are whiz with rocks. They were able to do something or other to that rock and get water out. That's what it means when it says in the pasuk, when God says, you didn't sanctify me. There's no apparent presence of God in this story. In other words, it's just they want water. So Moshe says, you know what? Okay, me and Aaron are going to bring forth water. V'to b'mamar Moshe v'Aaron. And the language of Moshe and Aaron was misleading. Obviously, Moshe wasn't trying to convince them that he was doing this on his own, but he came up short. He should have been more clear. He should have been more expressive that this is the act of God. If you remember at the beginning of this Ramban, we posed the question, why does it say you stole from me? Ma'alta me'ila is when someone takes something from the Beis HaMikdash. So what does he mean you were moel against me? Ramban says maybe this is what it means, or the Rebbeinu Hananel says maybe this is what it means, that you gained honor for yourselves through my actions, through God's actions. Maybe that's also the language in you rebelled by the mouth. Hashem told Moshe, you should speak to the rock in front of the people. Vatam b'shmi. The idea of speaking to the rock in front of the people is in the name of God. That I should be sanctified in the eyes of the people, and you came up short in the manner in which you spoke. So this is the Rabbeinu Hananel's pshat. Certainly also interesting to keep in mind. Okay, let's go ahead. Verse 14. Moshe sends messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. So says your brother Israel. You know all of the difficulties that have found us. Verse 15, our forefathers went down to Egypt. We lived for many years in Egypt, and the Egyptians treated us very poorly. And we davened to God, and He took us out. Verse 17, let us go through your land. We won't pass through the field or the vineyard. We won't drink from the well. We just want a path through. Just give us a path through. We won't take your things. Don't worry. Verse 18, Vayomer elav Edom lo savorbi, and Edom said, you will not pass through me. Pen bacherev eitzei likrosecha. If you try, I'm going to be there with my sword. And the Jewish people went around. Okay, interesting story. Very basic question. Did this king have a name? There are various kings that the Jewish people encounter in the Chumash who are referred to. Sichon, Og, those are famous names of the Chumash. Is there a reason we didn't name this person? It's a very basic question. Ramban on Pasuk Yud Daled, El Melech Edom. Lo Hiskir Akasav Shmo. The Pasuk doesn't mention his name. Ki Ein Sorach. There's no need for it. Aval Hiskir, I mean, who cares what his name is? It's irrelevant. Aval Hiskir Sichon va'og, Malchi Amori b'Shmosam. It does refer to Sichon and Og, the Amorite kings by name. Bavur came Yeduim Bigvura. They're known to be mighty people. Vilohem Shem Bagoim, they were famous. Lahodos, the fun of Yis'alaki Asei Manu Lahafli. Their names are mentioned in the Chumash because the fact that the Jewish people were able to defeat them, these famous people, is a greater glorification of God. But this is neither here nor there. It's just a bump along the way. So just an interesting, just technical Ramban. Okay, now let's jump ahead to chapter 21. Chapter 21, verse 1. Aaron has just died. By the way, this king was also not referred to by name. You know, the king of Arad heard that the Jewish people were in the area, Vayilachem b'Yisrael, and he fought against the Jewish people, Vayishp mimenu shevi, and he took a captive from the Jewish people. The Medrash says there was a young Jewish girl who was taken. Verse 2, Vayidar Yisrael neder l'Hashem vayomar. The Jewish people took a vow to God. Im nason titenes ha'am hazeh biyadi. If you give over this nation into my hands, if you help us succeed, v'acharam tiyas areihem, and I will devote everything that we find to God. Verse 3, Vayishma Hashem b'kol Yisrael. God heard the voice of Israel. The Jewish people were victorious over the Canaanites, and they dedicated what they took to the Mishkan, and the place was called Charma. Okay, and then on with the story. It's a really interesting Ramban over here. It's the Ramban on Pasuk Aleph. Is actually a very long Ramban here, but I would say it's around 80% of the way through the Ramban. Probably around 20 lines from the end, 25 lines from the end, beginning with the words Nisoreru. Nisoreru achachamim bazeh. The commentators are very struck by this. Mipnei datam shelo Yisrael menutzachim klal me'oyev zulasi be'es kal kolasam. There's a general approach. Truth is, it's an approach to Tanakh in general, but certainly to the experience of the Jews in the desert, that generally speaking, they only faced losses when they had some spiritual flaw of the moment. Kagon b'milchemes Amalek harishona. Like the first time they fought Amalek, they had losses. The teaching is that soon before that it had been recorded in the Torah. They asked, is God really in our midst? Yeah? You want to know if I'm in your midst? I'll introduce you to Amalek. Uvashniya mipnei chetam b'meraglim. Shizhira mimenu Moshe. They had a second problem with Amalek because of the sin of the spies. Ava b'chol milchemas mitzvah lo nifkad mehem ish kol yemei Moshe. Throughout Moshe's leadership of the Jewish people, if there was a time where there was a mitzvah for them to fight a war that they were initiating because that's what God wanted them to do, they didn't lose a soul. And we have these experiences where God seems to have brought difficulties upon them because of sins that they committed. But what happened here? Why did this girl get kidnapped or taken prisoner? Why did that happen? We don't see them doing anything wrong over here. Ulefichach pirshu akasuv hazeh vayish mimenu hashvi shahaya biyado v'yashivcha hazu sheshavu osa Yisrael mehem. So there's actually a very interesting pshat that actually this young girl had been taken by the Jews from the Canaanites. And so they kind of came to get her back. They took from him. So, but clearly the whole pshat here is trying to address this question. How could the Jews lose someone if they hadn't done anything wrong in this time in the desert? V'alderech hapshat, But the Ramban says, I think the straightforward meaning of the verse is, Inyan HaKasuv Lomar, Ki lo harag mehem HaKnani hazeh shum adam. The Canaanites did not kill anybody. Avol shava mehem muatim, but they did take a small amount of captives. V'kasher nasan oso Hashem biyadam, heishivu esakol. But once God helped the Jews succeed against the Canaanites, they got all of their captives back. V'lo nifkad mehem ish, and they didn't lose anybody. So this all seems to be a kind of a not so significant story. Doesn't seem particularly important to the process of them getting from point A to point B. Whatever problem that we have was canceled out by them, fighting back. So what does this even need to be said for? Since the Jews saw that the Canaanites had successfully taken some of their people hostage, you know why this story is recorded in the Chumash, says the Ramban? Because the Jewish people had a problem, and they vowed that if God helped them, they would give charity, they would give donations to the Mishkan, and it worked. God listened to them. This is an instructive story, that if we have difficulties, if we have problems, let's daven, let's pledge mitzvos, let's do something. And this is a model for later in the Torah, for later in Jewish life. But the Ramban says, don't think that the takeaway from this story is they lost for no reason. Nobody died. There were captives taken. We see what we're supposed to do when things aren't going our way, and it worked out. It's possible that we could say, Ki katzav Hashem al Aknani hazeh bavur sheba me'eretz merchakim lilachem im Yisrael v'lo yarei Elokim v'ratza sheyeh lecherem. Okay, a very interesting other possibility the Ramban says. The Ramban says, maybe we're looking at this story all wrong. Maybe this story is not about the Jews. Maybe this story is about the Canaanim. That Hashem was bothered that the Canaanim didn't have greater regard for the Jewish people, who are developing a reputation as being God's chosen nation, and a very powerful nation at that, because they're God's chosen people. And here it is, these Canaanim just come to fight with the Jews. So Hashem, as a punishment to the Canaanim, God rewards and punishes non-Jews as well. As a punishment to the Canaanim, Hashem orchestrates events that they'll successfully take some captives. Because once they successfully take captives, now the Jews are really going to be motivated to really fight hard against them, and they'll daven, etc. And then they're really going to show the Canaanim a thing or two. So that's just a very different way of looking at the whole story. So just to sum up this Ramban, one possibility is actually it wasn't even a Jew that was taken captive. It was someone who had come over from the Canaanim. The next point is nobody was killed. There were some captives taken, and they got them all back. But we learned from this story what we're supposed to do when things aren't going our way. And the third possibility is maybe this whole story is more about Hashem punishing the Canaanim than Hashem punishing the Jews. All interesting ideas. We had the Rabbeinu Hanano's perspective on what happened with Moshe and the rock. We had the Ramban on the topic of why the king of Edom was not named. And we had the Ramban on what exactly is going on in this story of the fight with the Canaanim.